Madeline, after 19 years. We're dissolving your role, he said without emotion. Please clear your workspace by the end of the day. My name is Madeline Price. I'm 51. And until this past Monday morning, I was a senior systems architect at Kensington Dynamics, just outside Denver, Colorado. For nearly 2 decades, I was the quiet force behind every major IT evolution, from dial-up to full cloud migration. I'd outlasted 4 CEOs, survived 2 company-wide restructurings, trained everyone from interns to executives, and held the fort through holidays, blackouts, and budget cuts. So when Trevor, the new VP of Operations, summoned me to his glass office, with Dana from HR already seated stiffly, I already knew. The tone of the office had shifted weeks ago. I just hadn't said it out loud. I understand, I replied, steady and calm. I gathered my things silently. No pleas, no scenes, just silent resolve. From the corner of my eye, I saw junior engineers I'd mentored avoiding my gaze. They didn't know that everything they relied on still had my fingerprints in its foundation. My hand hesitated briefly over the framed photo of my son at his first science fair. I slid it gently into my box. Dana tried to meet my eyes, maybe to offer some corporate sympathy, but I didn't need it. As I walked past the glass wall, Trevor stood there, arms crossed. Not to say goodbye, but to make sure I actually left. Some stories start with applause. Mine starts with a closed door. If you've ever been underestimated or replaced without reason, don't scroll past. Like, subscribe, and share this story. Someone out there needs to hear it. Back at my desk, I moved with quiet precision, packing items not just from drawers, but from years. The ceramic mug my son made in middle school. A tiny aloe plant that had somehow outlived 2 department heads. My old wireless mouse, scratched but reliable. I could feel eyes on me. Young developers I'd trained when they were still learning the difference between front-end and infrastructure. They looked away quickly, as if loyalty was contagious, and they didn't want to catch it. None of them knew how deeply I'd built into Kensington systems. They worked in sleek interfaces I'd helped construct, completely unaware of the layered architecture humming beneath. The admin credentials, buried under 3 layers of redundancy. The software patch they deployed last quarter. I wrote the script that made it safe to install. Bethany, from marketing, rushed over, her heels clicking against the tile. Madeline, I just heard. This is absurd. You basically are this place. I managed a small smile. Companies change. People get rewritten. But with no warning? After everything? It's fine, I said gently. It wasn't fine. But it would be. As I walked toward the elevators, I didn't look back. Not at Trevor. Not at the floor I'd once called mine. But in my pocket, next to my keys, was something no one knew I had. A key they'd forgotten I still held. One they'd regret overlooking. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the numbness had given way to something sharper. Clarity. I sat in the car a moment longer, staring at the quiet house where my son grew up, where my husband Eli and I built a life between server failures and dinner at 8 p.m. Inside, everything was still. No rush, no pings, no calendar invites. Just the distant hum of the refrigerator and the steady beat of my own breathing. I poured myself a glass of water and walked to my home office. The chair creaked the same way it always did. The monitor blinked awake. But something had shifted. They thought I'd just disappear. Years ago, when legal was panicking over a breach, I'd built the audit system they still relied on. One that logged every login, every privilege escalation, every silent permissions tweak. I'd warned them that insider threats didn't come with red flags, just silence. And to protect them, I'd built off-site backups, with full approval at the time. Forgotten now, buried under new policies and younger priorities. I reached for the drawer beneath my desk and pulled out the slim flash drive I hadn't touched in over a year. As the files loaded, I leaned back, the faint blue glow flickering across my face. They thought I was just a legacy system. But legacy systems remember everything. It started small, unusual transfer records buried deep within Kensington's financial systems. Just another routine scan. The kind no one but me still bothered running. But the numbers didn't add up. The vendor name was unfamiliar. Orion Integrated Services. Newly registered, vague service descriptions, invoices approved without corresponding ticket logs. And the address? A virtual office parked behind a UPS store off B25. The payments began modestly. A few thousand here, a service retainer there. But each month they grew. Quietly, consistently, and always just low enough to avoid triggering standard audit alerts. I cross-checked the approval chain. Every single one had been signed off by Bryce Ellison, Kensington's CFO. I kept digging, matched timestamps, matched invoice IDs. The name on Orion's business registration? Liam Cartwright, Bryce's brother-in-law. I'd seen him once at a company gala. Tall, quiet, friendly handshake. I didn't speak, didn't confront. Just watched. Copied everything. This wasn't a mistake. It was a system. A funnel disguised as innovation, with trust weaponized into vulnerability. And they thought I wouldn't notice, that I'd go quietly. But for 19 years, I'd protected that company like it was my own. Now, I knew exactly what I was protecting it from. And who. The next morning, I woke to silence. No 6 a.m. alarm. No badge scan. No sprint to beat Denver traffic. Just the sound of wind brushing the porch and Eli moving softly through the kitchen. He placed a cup of coffee beside me, then leaned against the doorway without a word. After 19 years together, he knew some wounds need space, not stitching. When he left for the store, I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Beneath a file of old receipts and retired chargers was a second flash drive. Not just a backup, the backup. The one I kept offline, segmented and encrypted. Years ago, when legal asked me to design a system that could detect insider threats, I'd insisted on external redundancy. They agreed, then forgot. But I didn't. I plugged in the drive. Emails, meeting notes, access logs no ordinary employee should have seen. And the full payment history to Orion Integrated Services, nearly $2.1 million over 20 months. Not inflated for imaginary services, just marked up for real ones. By 10%, 15%, sometimes 22%. Each approval traced back to Bryce. And every transaction aligned perfectly with upgrades we supposedly implemented across departments, most of which had never been fully rolled out. I leaned back, staring at the evidence, and felt something shift inside me. Not rage, not even grief. Something steadier, colder. They thought they'd erased me. But they'd just freed the one person who knew exactly where the pressure points lived. And this time, I wasn't going to fix anything. I was going to expose it all. I sat in my car across from Kensington Dynamics just before 9 a.m. The building stood tall, cold, familiar. Through the tinted window, I watched as employees I'd mentored streamed inside, clutching coffees and conversations I used to be part of. My laptop rested on the passenger seat, open to a secure browser. Years ago, I'd created a testing email address that mimicked Kensington's internal format. Invisible to the directory. Still active, still mine. At 9:15, I sent the first move. Subject line: financial irregularities. Urgent review needed. Recipient: Trevor Galt, Vice President of Operations. Body: a concise summary of what I'd found, just enough truth to rattle his composure. I left out the family connection. Let him fill in the blanks. By 9:43, my phone vibrated. Trevor's number. I let it go to voicemail. Madeline, we need to talk immediately. Please call me back as soon as you can. I didn't. Instead, I closed the laptop and drove to a quiet cafe on the edge of town. I chose a booth near the back, set up again, and waited. At 10:28, a new message landed. this time from Dana in HR. Ms. Price, the company has received concerning communication from you that may breach your exit terms. Please refrain from further contact with Kensington employees. Failure to comply may result in legal action. So that was the strategy. Intimidate, isolate, discredit. But they'd miscalculated. I hadn't signed any separation agreement. There was nothing to breach. Only silence they hoped would hold. And it was already breaking. By noon, I was at the bank. Small branch, discreet staff. The same safe deposit box I'd held for over a decade. Inside, nestled between old tax records and encrypted archives, was a drive even older than the one I used at home. This one held the originals. I drove back slowly, every red light giving me space to think, to remember. Back in my office, I plugged in the drive. The system recognized it instantly, his access chain still intact, a small oversight in their panic to shut me out. I pulled up the documentation, the original security framework I designed, detailing system permissions across departments. There it was. 18 months ago, Bryce Ellison had personally authorized extended financial access rights for himself. The exact same period when payments to Orion Integrated Services began. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls. Trevor, Dana, and now Julian Ward, the consultant who'd been advising IT on digital modernization. I hadn't expected him to move so quickly. That told me something. Julian wasn't just a bystander. I opened my personal inbox. A message from Noah, one of my junior analysts. They're saying you sent some explosive email. Julian's called an emergency meeting. They're locking down access, even historical stuff. What's happening? I typed slowly. Don't get involved, Noah. Just watch. Because the fuse had already been lit, and no amount of scrambling would stop what was coming next. At 3:02 p.m., the landline rang, a number I hadn't used for business in years. I let it ring once, twice, before lifting the receiver. Madeline, it's Bryce Ellison. His voice was measured, low, the kind of calm reserved for people used to controlling rooms. I think we should talk. There's clearly been a misunderstanding. Is that what you're calling it? Look, he continued unfazed. Transitions are tricky. If you have questions about company finances, the board is the proper channel. No need, I cut in. I believe they'll be quite interested in Orion Integrated Services. And your brother-in-law's role? There was a pause. Sharp, breath-held silence on the other end. You're making a serious mistake, he said finally. Let's not escalate this. We can make things right. A generous severance, full references, anything you need. I already had everything I needed, Bryce, I said, then hung up. 10 minutes later, an email from Dana landed in my inbox. The subject line was simple. Updated severance terms. The offer had doubled. Attached was a document requiring full confidentiality regarding all matters related to Kensington Dynamics. They were scrambling now, throwing money at a problem they thought could be bought quiet. But I wasn't after compensation. I was after truth, and truth doesn't sign NDAs. That night, I barely slept. Not out of fear, out of focus. I sat at my desk with 2 monitors lit, a cup of cold tea forgotten beside me. I wasn't just following money anymore. I was following patterns. 3 years ago, not long after Bryce was promoted to CFO, another vendor surfaced, Holloway Strategy Group. Familiar tactics, vague consulting services, inflated invoices, no internal work orders to match. The listed CEO, Emma Holloway, Bryce's wife. The firm had no employees, no active website. Just a virtual address and a paper trail carefully folded between quarterly reports. I kept digging. Then came the emails. Buried deep in my archive was a thread I'd been copied on accidentally years ago. Back when systems weren't yet fully siloed. And there it was. Julian Ward, the consultant who'd modernized us, had bypassed the normal procurement process altogether. Because he wasn't brought in to modernize. He was brought in to erase me. Daniel, my old director, had been asking too many questions about IT budgets. That's when Trevor replaced him. That's when I started being excluded. They needed someone silent, disposable, invisible. I wasn't that person. Not anymore. I created a detailed report. Dates, numbers, registrations, internal approvals, and personal ties. It wasn't just fraud. It was coordinated. And they'd built it on a foundation they thought no one would bother checking. But I was the one who built that foundation. And I knew exactly where the cracks were. At 7:42 a.m., I dialed a number I hadn't used in years. "Robert Lynn, please," I said to the receptionist. A moment later, the voice on the line cracked through memory like a warm breeze on a frozen morning. "Madeline Price. Haven't heard that name in a while." "Not by choice," I said. Robert had served on Kensington's board for over a decade, and though now semi-retired, he still attended quarterly meetings. Years ago, he and I had worked closely on a company-wide encryption protocol. He was one of the few who actually read reports, really read them. "I need 15 minutes. Face to face, his pause told me everything. He already knew something was wrong. "Where?" An hour later, we sat across from each other in a quiet park, the breeze stirring leaves across the bench between us. I handed him a sealed envelope and a flash drive. "This is everything," I said. "Transactions, ties, timestamps. I'm not asking for anything. I just want the board to know." Robert studied me. "Why me?" "Because you ask questions others don't." He nodded slowly, sliding the envelope into his coat. "There's an emergency session scheduled tomorrow. Finance review. Convenient timing." "Unavoidable," I said softly. As I stood to leave, he called out gently, "Madeline, are you doing this for justice? Or revenge?" He didn't turn around. Does it matter, as long as the truth gets out? Friday morning arrived clear and cold. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the neighborhood stir to life. For once, there was no rush. No lanyard, no meeting alerts. Just stillness. And a clock ticking toward 8 a.m. At exactly 8 a.m., the email delivered itself. Using credentials Julian's team had failed to deactivate, I'd scheduled a message to every member of the board. The subject line was quiet. The contents were not. Attached, the full report. Every vendor connection, every inflated invoice, every name. At 8:17, my phone buzzed with a first unknown number. I let it ring. Then another, and another. I recognized the pattern. Assistants scrambling to reach me before the Emergency Finance Committee meeting at 9 o'clock. I didn't answer any of them. At 9:32, a message lit up from Noah. "Police are here. Bryce and Trevor being questioned in separate rooms. Julian looks sick. What did you do?" I didn't reply. This wasn't a moment for explanation. It was a moment for impact. By 10:03, the company's general counsel was on the line. Patricia Graves. Unlike the others, I answered this one. "Ms. Price," she began, voice tight. "We need you to come in immediately to discuss the documents you shared." "I'm available by phone." "This requires—" "No," I said, calm, unshaken. "Everything I know is in that report. And if anything happens to me or my family, it goes to the SEC, the IRS, and 3 national outlets." Silence. Then, measured, careful. "The board is taking this extremely seriously." Good. Because now, so is everyone else. By lunchtime, I was 30 miles outside Denver at a quiet diner I used to visit during business trips. A corner booth, a clear view of the door. I needed space, somewhere off the radar. I ate slowly, barely tasting anything. My mind scanning through possibilities even faster than the forensic accountants surely were by now. News started to break by mid-afternoon. First on local business blogs, then regional finance networks. Kensington Dynamics under investigation for financial irregularities. No names yet, but they would come. At 2:07, my phone lit up with Robert Lynn's number. I picked up on the second ring. "It's a bloodbath," he said, skipping pleasantries. Bryce cracked the moment he saw the evidence. Tried to cut a deal. Blamed Trevor for pressuring him. Trevor's denying everything. Julian's pretending he was just a consultant. I said nothing. The board suspended all three. Forensic team estimates over $4.5 million skimmed across 3 years. Maybe more. They're digging now. I exhaled slowly. I'd estimated close to that. Closer than I wanted to be. "We want to talk," Robert continued. "Not just about reinstating you. We're creating a new position, Chief Information Security Officer. Direct report to the board, full oversight. It's yours if you want it." I'd considered the possibility. But even now, with everything falling into place, part of me hesitated. Walking back meant returning to the place that tried to erase me. Still, I said only, "I'll think about it." Because even victories come with choices, and this one wasn't finished yet. That evening, I told Eli everything. We sat in the living room, the sun slanting low across the hardwood floor. I walked him through the data trails, the fake vendors, the call with Bryce. I spoke evenly. No dramatics, just facts. Truth carried its own weight now. Eli didn't interrupt. He just listened, nodding at the right moments, jaw tightening when I described the severance bribe, the threats, the silence that followed. When I finished, he simply asked, "What do you want to do?" I didn't answer right away. The fight was over. The names were exposed. The people who tried to bury me were buried in audits and subpoenas. But their downfall didn't feel like triumph. It felt still. The fire that had kept me up those first few nights, fueled by disbelief, anger, betrayal, had cooled. What remained wasn't rage. It was something cleaner. A quiet certainty, completion. Later that night, I opened my laptop and logged into a profile I hadn't touched in months, my old LinkedIn account. I hadn't posted since 2019. I typed slowly, deliberately. Never burn bridges. Just let them collapse under the weight of their own greed. I hit post and closed the screen. Within minutes, messages began to pour in. From former colleagues, competitors, even strangers in the industry. But I wasn't reading them. Not yet. Because sometimes, the loudest statement you make is walking away without saying a word. Monday morning came crisp and bright. I stepped out of the car in a charcoal gray suit I hadn't worn in years. The air felt different. Cooler, sharper, as if the building itself sensed the shift. Inside Kensington's lobby, the security guard did a double take. "Ms. Price, welcome back," he said, standing a little straighter. He handed me a visitor badge. I clipped it on and stepped into the elevator alone. For nearly 2 decades, I'd worked in that building. But never once had I been invited to the executive floor. Today, I was expected. The boardroom was larger than I imagined. Glass walls, polished table, a skyline view of Denver I'd only ever glimpsed in employee newsletters. 10 board members sat waiting. Robert Lynn gave me a slight nod as I entered. The interim CEO, a woman I barely knew, cleared her throat. "Ms. Price," she began, "thank you for coming. What you've uncovered is unprecedented." I said nothing. "The scope of the fraud," she continued, "goes beyond initial estimates. Forensic teams place the loss at nearly $5.2 million. Criminal charges are underway." I remained silent. Robert leaned forward. "The board has unanimously agreed to offer you the new role, Chief Information Security Officer. Full authority, direct access to the board." I placed a folder on the table. Inside are my terms. Non-negotiable. She opened it, scanned quickly, then raised her brows. "Full audit authority, independent budget, veto power." I nodded once. "This is unusual," she said carefully. "So is stealing $5 million, I replied. The room felt quiet. They had until noon. I had other offers. And for once, the power sat exactly where it belonged. At 11:47, the call came. They'd accepted every condition. 6 months later, I sat in a corner office that overlooked the Denver skyline, a view I never asked for, but had earned. The desk was clean, the protocols tighter, and the chain of oversight unbroken. Bryce Ellison had pled guilty in exchange for cooperation. He'd served time, though less than he deserved. Trevor Galt was still trying to deny involvement, clinging to the idea that distance meant innocence. Didn't. And Julian Ward? He'd vanished for Brazil. Extradition was already in motion. The money, most of it, had been recovered, enough to stabilize operations and preserve jobs. My former team now reported to me, but I'd promoted Noah to manage day-to-day systems. The kid had potential. He just needed someone to see it. At noon, there was a soft knock at the door. Eli stood there, smiling. "Lunch?" I grabbed my jacket and joined him. As we walked past the rows of servers and quiet desks, I noticed the hush that followed. Not of fear, but of respect. They knew. Not every detail, but enough. They knew I could have walked away and let it all collapse, but I didn't. In the elevator, Eli gently squeezed my hand. "Are you happy?" I considered the question. The anger was gone. What remained wasn't quite joy, but it was solid, clean, whole. "I'm good," I said simply. Outside, the October sun caught the glass above us. I checked my phone. A message from Robert. "Security budget approved. Unanimous vote." I smiled. Some bridges collapse. Others, when rebuilt the right way, become stronger than ever before. It was nearly midnight when the message arrived. My phone vibrated once. No caller ID, no preview. Just a single line of text on a secured channel I hadn't used in years. "Not everyone's gone, Madeline. Be careful who you trust." I stared at it for a moment. Then again. The sender was anonymous. No reply route. The kind of message only someone with deep internal knowledge could send without triggering a trace. Someone who understood the old systems. Someone who still had access. I didn't wake Eli. I didn't panic. Instead, I walked to my home office, sat down, and opened a secure terminal. My new role gave me full oversight. But even I hadn't yet touched the deepest layers, those sections of the infrastructure that predated Kensington's current architecture. The parts I had built, and I found it. A dormant user account, last active 12 hours ago. It had root-level access and a masked identity layer, buried beneath layers of system updates. No logs tied it to any known executive or employee. But I recognized the footprint. Whoever it was. They weren't just surviving the purge. They were still inside, watching. I leaned back in my chair, pulse steady, mind sharp. The cleanup was far from over. What I'd uncovered before, it wasn't the end. It was just the first breach. And whoever remained in the shadows had just made a mistake. They warned me. And now I was watching back.